Hello everyone, and welcome. I'm excited to kick off today's presentation on a very important topic: diversity, inequality, and institutionalization. The title is Why Difference Makes a Difference. Over the next few minutes, we'll explore how differences among people impact our societies, institutions, and everyday lives. We'll look at both the challenges and opportunities that come with diversity. So, let's get started and see why understanding these issues really matters. These disparities are not natural or inevitable. They are manufactured, constructed through laws, customs, and how institutions are designed. When I say not natural, I mean that these inequalities aren't something we're born with. They're created by societal choices. You'll notice that patterns of inequality tend to align closely with group identities, whether that's race, ethnicity, religion, or gender, and this pattern holds true across different countries and throughout history. It's a consistent phenomenon, not a coincidence. This isn't just an abstract idea. It's an empirical reality, something we can see clearly through evidence and data. These disparities have been shaped over centuries of history and are deeply embedded in the institutions that govern our lives, from education and justice to employment and healthcare. What this means is that differences in race, ethnicity, religion, gender, and other identities systematically influence outcomes: who gets ahead, who struggles, and who gets left behind. So the core question we need to ask is, why does these differences matter so much? Why do they have such a powerful impact on people's lives? That's what we'll explore as we move forward. Once these hierarchies are embedded in institutions, they tend to become self-reinforcing, meaning they support themselves over time and resist change. This is because institutions, like laws, policies, and social norms, solidify these differences, making them seem natural or unavoidable. Historically, these processes gradually turned group differences into legally and socially enforced hierarchies, which further entrenched inequality. It's important to understand that differences between groups, on their own, don't automatically create rankings or hierarchies. Instead, these rankings are constructed through social processes and institutional practices. Most notably, we see that diversity and hierarchical inequality have always traveled together, with racial hierarchies being the most prominent example. These hierarchies place some groups above others, often based on race, and have deep roots in history. So, when we talk about the roots of inequality, it's crucial to recognize how these constructed hierarchies are reinforced over time, shaping the social landscape we live in today. When we look at education, housing, employment, and criminal justice, we see that all of these areas still carry embedded biases that have persisted over time, as highlighted by the National Academies in 2023. These biases are not just incidental, they are deeply rooted in the structural systems that shape our society. When we talk about structural domains, we're referring to the laws and policies that have historically enshrined racial advantages in explicit legal language. These are the rules written into law that explicitly favored certain groups over others, creating a foundation of inequality that was formalized and codified. Moving beyond the laws themselves, we see that governments, organizations, and social networks play a role in embedding biases that are often more subtle but equally impactful. These biases are cultural, linguistic, economic, and based on identity, quietly reinforcing advantages for some and disadvantages for others without always being overt or intentional. This process of institutionalization is really the engine that keeps these inequalities enduring over time. It's this complex web of policies and social practices that perpetuates disparities across generations, making it difficult for marginalized groups to break free from these embedded biases. So, understanding these concepts helps us see how systemic inequalities are maintained, not just through explicit laws, but also through the ongoing reinforcement of biases within our social institutions. And that's a critical piece of the broader conversation about how to create a more equitable society. So, what this slide is really emphasizing is that structural racism is incredibly resilient. It's not something that can be easily dismantled by targeting just one institution. Think of it like a buckyball, a structure where forces applied to one part are spread throughout the entire system. This means that even if we intervene in one area, the rest of the system can support and maintain the whole, making it resistant to change. Importantly, structural racism isn't just about one institution acting alone. Instead, it's a web of interconnected institutions, all operating under racialized rules that work together to uphold white supremacy. This interconnectedness is what makes it so complex and persistent, and it's why addressing it requires a systemic approach rather than isolated efforts. This concept really ties into our overall theme, understanding how deeply embedded and resilient these systems are, and why genuine change demands a comprehensive, systemic effort. In reality, perceived group membership has a powerful impact on access to resources, social status, and life outcomes at every level. It's not just about individual qualities, but how society views and categorizes us. Now, let's imagine a society where our group identity, whether it's ethnicity, religion, or race, was completely independent of rankings like wealth, education, or power. It's a hypothetical world, but it helps us see how deeply intertwined these factors are in our actual world. As Brubaker pointed out in 2015, who gets what is deeply intertwined with who is perceived as what. This means that perceptions about identity shape the distribution of opportunities and resources far more than we might think. And this leads us to the idea of the illusion of difference-blind mechanisms. It's the misconception that systems operate without regard to identity, as if they're truly neutral. But in reality, these mechanisms often mask underlying biases and perceptions that influence decision-making, making it seem fair when it's not. Understanding this connection is crucial because it highlights how societal perceptions and mechanisms reinforce existing inequalities, even when they appear to be neutral on the surface. Let's take a closer look at why many existing institutions struggle to create real change. First, these institutions are often designed to reproduce themselves, meaning they tend to resist change and reform efforts face huge inertia. This is what we call a status quo bias. Courts, for example, tend to overlook practices that don't explicitly discriminate, so they rarely push for systemic reforms. Then there are what I'd call legal blind spots. These are areas where diversity training and grievance systems produce documentation and a sense of progress, but they don't really change the underlying power structures. They create a surface-level fix, giving the appearance of progress while the deeper, structural inequalities remain untouched. Why do these approaches fall short? Well, often they result in formal rules like non-discrimination policies or diversity programs that look good on paper. But courts rarely enforce these rules to force meaningful reform. Diversity initiatives might have ended legal exclusion, but they often leave the existing power structures in place. And then we have civil rights laws, another example of past solutions that, while important, have their limits. They've achieved some progress, but they haven't fundamentally transformed the systems that produce inequality. So overall, these efforts may seem like progress on the surface, but underneath, structural inequality persists. That's why genuine change requires more than just surface-level policies. It demands a rethinking of the very institutions and structures that sustain inequality. Let's take a closer look at the relationship between difference and inequality. Some distinctions that once had a clear, sharp edge have started to fade over time. But at the same time, others have persisted or even become more pronounced in new forms. Today's reality is that the connection between difference and inequality isn't fixed. It depends heavily on the context, including time, place, and political environment. What might be true in one society or era might look very different in another. Looking back historically, there were periods when certain distinctions operated at their maximum force. These distinctions were legally enforced, socially absolute, and maintained through violence, making inequality deeply embedded in the fabric of society. And it's important to recognize that categorical differences, such as black and white, male and female, citizen and immigrant, are not just related to inequality. They actively shape the production and reproduction of inequality itself. These differences aren't just correlated with inequality. They are part of the mechanisms that create and sustain it. So, understanding this interplay helps us see that inequality isn't just about individual differences. It's about how those differences are constructed, reinforced, and sometimes challenged within specific social and political contexts. Now, let's focus on confronting the internalized biases and group-based perceptions that help sustain these unequal systems. These biases are often deeply ingrained, and addressing them requires us to challenge our own assumptions and perceptions. One key concept here is what social psychologists call epistemological ignorance. This is the deliberate forgetting or ignoring of the history and mechanisms of inequality, which prevents us from fully understanding the roots of these issues. On a cultural level, we need to reform our institutions, things like laws, policies, and how resources are distributed. This isn't just about surface-level changes. It's about actively dismantling the advantages that certain groups have historically held. From a structural perspective, as Di Tommaso highlighted in 2021, breaking the link between diversity and inequality isn't something we can do with a single intervention. It requires simultaneous action across these three levels: social, psychological, cultural, and structural. This multi-level approach is essential because, as we've seen, addressing inequality is complex and interconnected. No one action alone can create lasting change. To move forward effectively, we need comprehensive anti-racist responses that tackle all these levels together, recognizing that true equity involves ongoing, coordinated efforts across society. To truly achieve substantive equality, we need coordinated anti-racist action that addresses not just individual attitudes, but also the structural, cultural, and psychological frameworks that sustain inequality. This means we must act at every level, understanding that change isn't just about policies on paper, but about transforming the very rules that govern our institutions. First, we have to acknowledge the racialized rules that shape how institutions operate. Only once we recognize these underlying frameworks can we work towards meaningful change. It's not enough to just tweak policies. We need to confront the system itself. Next, we should focus on the resilient connections among institutions. Instead of looking at policies in isolation, we need to see how different parts of the system reinforce each other. How, for example, education, employment, and healthcare systems are interconnected in ways that perpetuate disparities. Addressing these connections is essential for lasting progress. And then, we have to look deeper. Superficial diversity initiatives might look good on the surface, but they often don't challenge the embedded biases within our institutions. Real progress requires dismantling these biases at their root, not just decorating our institutions with surface-level diversity efforts. So, in conclusion, reimagining our institutions for true equity involves a fundamental shift. We need to rethink and reshape the systems themselves, creating a future where equity is built into the foundation, not just an afterthought. Only then can we hope to achieve the genuine, lasting change we all want to see.